Welcome to Structures, the show that delves into Toronto's rich history and architecture. I'm Heather Seaman. The Toronto Islands have been a cherished destination for generations. But for the fortunate few, this is home. Join me as we explore the Toronto Island community. The Toronto Island community is comprised of 262 homes, nestled along the shores of Wards Island and Algonquin Island.
Sometimes I wake up and I look out and I can't believe that it's part of my landscape.
It's really wonderful when there's a place with no cars. The kids play out in the streets. They play all around. People are walking. I meet my neighbors. It's a wonderful model for living.
In fact, a friend of mine said to me, if you're not an artist before you move to the island, you should become one once you move to the island.
This is now an island. We always think of it as an island, but it wasn't an island when the first settlers began moving in here.
Originally a peninsula, the Toronto Islands were formed by the current that eroded the Scarborough Bluffs and carried its sandy soil westward to form the peninsula. In 1858, the shoal that emerged just off the mouth of the Don River was severed by a storm, making it an island, or rather, a group of interconnected islands. As early as the 1830s, fishermen had begun petitioning the government for this land. One of the earliest families to settle here when it was still a peninsula was the Wards. Wards Island is named after David Ward, one of the original fishermen to settle on the peninsula. The Ward family has actually had a continuous presence on the island for about 180 years.
I think the most famous person in the family was his son William, and he became famous as a lifesaver, and he got into it under very tragic circumstances when he was a kid. And I'll just read you a very short excerpt from a book called William Ward, Island Hero. It was on a fateful spring day in 1862 that young William gathered his 5 younger sisters, Rose Ellen, Jane, Cecilia, Phoebe, and Marianne, and so the children set out from the beach in front of the Ward homestead for an afternoon of sailing. And then a terrible tragedy where a sudden storm came up and the boat was capsized, and he desperately tried to rescue his sisters. He got the boat upright, he got his sisters back into the boat, and then the wind came and knocked them all out again, and the second time he couldn't rescue them and they were all lost. And I think the way he attempted to heal himself was to become a lifesaver.
This was in the days of sail. Not entirely. There were a number of boats that would have had steam engines, but there were a lot of schooners that had no engine on them, so they were pretty risky to sail.
One spectacular rescue saw William Ward brave the icy waters.
The schooner was floundering, and the sailors were lashed to the mast, and William Ward insisted on going out and rescued them.
They were frozen to the mast, so he went to get them, and I think in this case with a partner, a friend of his, and they had to knock the ice off the sailors to get them off the mast to bring them back to the shore.
When the first island rescue station was established in 1880, Captain William Ward naturally took the helm. Throughout his life, William saved 167 people from the depths of Lake Ontario. William opened the first incarnation of the Wards Hotel on his fishing reserve in 1876. Its success inspired him to build a more elaborate hotel in 1882. In the mid-1930s, it was turned into a grocery store until deterioration led to its demolition in 1966. In 1867, ownership of the Toronto Islands transferred from the federal government to the City of Toronto, and ever since, political decisions have shaped the island. City Council capitalized on the island's potential as a place of recreation and as a means of generating tax revenue. This vision of the islands as a park with a residential dimension is responsible for the unique character of the Toronto Islands. In the early 1870s, the city stimulated the island's residential development by offering lots for lease. Within a year, 28 leases were signed, and many of Toronto's elite families, like the Gooderhams and the Masseys, built cottages on Centre Island.
In the 1880s, what happened is that the Royal Canadian Yacht Club moved over here and built a clubhouse, and a number of the sailors, the members of the yacht club, wanted, summer places to live close to the yacht club. And so there began sort of a cottage community down at Centre Island.
My family's history is probably in two parts because Sir Casimir Zosky, who was the first Zosky in Canada, he came from Poland, and he would be my great-great-great-grandfather, had a house maybe on Centre. It would have been torn down when we came here, so I don't know exactly. I've never seen it.
However, the Toronto Islands were not the exclusive domain of the wealthy. Throngs of people packed the ferries that made the trek across the bay destined for fresh air and open beaches.
This was sort of Toronto's retreat for a long time. Remember, people didn't go up to Muskoka. People either couldn't afford it or they didn't own cars. Toronto Island was, the real recreation spot.
My parents bought a house almost 50 years ago on 2nd Street, and we used it as a summer house.
During the 1880s, some significant developments helped to cultivate the island. In 1883, Elizabeth McMaster established the Lakeside Home as a place for the tiny patients of Sick Children's Hospital to convalesce in the fresh air during the summer months. The Lakeside Home continued to welcome children until 1928. During World War II, the Lakeside Home was put to use by members of the Royal Norwegian Air Force who trained at the island airport and lived in a camp called Little Norway at the foot of Bathurst. In 1880, the city began transforming 200 acres of marshland into a public park. After 8 years and almost $130,000, the sprawling park opened in 1888. St. Andrew by the Lake was built in 1884 to tend to the spiritual needs of the island's summer residents. This quaint wooden church was built in the stick style, a staple of island architecture during the Victorian era. In 1959, the church property was sold to the City Parks Department, who relocated the church and leveled both the rectory and parish hall. The rector moved into 102 Lakeshore Road and lived there until 1979. Now known as the Rectory Cafe, this chic gallery and restaurant is a perennial favorite to islanders and visitors alike. While the Western Islands were developing, Ward's Island in the east retained its wild charm as the domain of hunters, birders, and the occasional day tripper bent on adventure. After the break, we'll learn more about the development of the Toronto Island community. Algonquin Island, formerly Sunfish Island, was a treeless stretch of sand, uninhabited, until the 1920s when the Queen City Yacht Club and the YMCA Boys Camp moved to the island. In 1880, the city began renting campsites to encourage more people to enjoy the eastern side of the Toronto Islands, a decision welcomed by eager Torontonians.
Center Island had been developed by more affluent people, so working people said, hey, you know, we deserve a place too on the island. And so the tenting was a very popular thing. So the city agreed to develop Wards Island as a tenting community.
Well, my grandparents came to the island in 1919. They had been brought up on farms north of the city, and but the farming life, I guess they decided, was not for them. The first year that they came here, she rented a tent site from a widow woman on First Street, and then they got their own tent site, and they bought a tent, and so just gradually got settled in. And the season was 24th of May until Thanksgiving. You can't be thinking about a typical camping tent, because it wasn't that. They were more like war surplus military tents with several rooms, and they were furnished with the usual array of furniture of the time. And she said that at least once during the summer there would be a high wind, which we experience here with some regularity, and the whole thing would blow over.
In the early 20s, the city standardized plot sizes and placed campsites along an orderly grid so that more tenters could enjoy island life.
By the 1920s, the Wardsies were saying to the city, hey, you know, this tent, we've sort of outgrown the tent. We want to build a more permanent structure. The city was resistant to that for quite a while.
To civilize the tenting experience, tenters started placing their tents on platforms, verandas began to appear, and they quietly placed wooden walls beneath the canvas tents. By 1931, the city formally allowed the conversion of tents into cottages, provided that they did not exceed 840 square feet. Despite the Depression, by 1937, there were 130 cottages and only 32 tents that remained on wards.
Over time, people built houses. Some of the houses, in fact, were prefab houses that were bought out of the Simpsons catalog. You can still see the shape over some of the houses on wards.
Algonquin Island, formerly Sunfish Island, was a treeless stretch of sand, uninhabited, until the 1920s when the Queen City Yacht Club and the YMCA Boys Camp moved to the island. Algonquin Island owes its residential development to the fate of Hanlon's Point, a resort area dotted with cottages, hotels, and an amusement park.
My father used to work at the amusement park at Hanlon's Point, and my dad was a clown in the amusement park, and my mother sold tickets in the box office. So rather than commute every day, they decided to rent a place on the island, and that started in 1932. So we've been here a long time. And Hanlon's Point was a very, very special place. The amusement park went up, the roof gardens went up, which was a dance hall. The roller pavilion where you could go roller skating, and this huge oval, which was all open to the stars. That was a beautiful spot to go when you were a kid.
In the 1930s, the Toronto Harbour Commission approached City Council about developing a combined air and seaplane base on Hanlon's Point. The Port George VI Airport broke ground in 1937. In order to make way for the airport, the amusement park, along with some cottages, had to go. Hanlon's Point cottagers scrambled to find a way to save their homes and eventually struck a deal with the city.
They wanted to retain their community, and so the city made a deal with them that they would develop this island and move the houses down, and that's what they did. They put a number of the houses on barges and barged them down and then winched them into place. Algonquin Island had houses on the periphery, but really no houses on the inside. Well, the war came along and there was no building. But after the Second World War we're talking about, a lot of the returning soldiers, they got a grant and they got their lot and they built their houses. A lot of the houses here were built by the residents themselves. This house was built in 1938. It hasn't really been changed very much because Well, I don't know. The house always had pretty good bones, is what my wife says, and she's right. So when we moved in, my first thought is, well, we'll take down this wall and we'll do that. And it wasn't long before we said, no, let's just keep it the way it is. Let's try and restore it, and that's what we've tried to do, is to keep the character of the house and maintain it.
And the 40s were, that's the beginning of the war years. When I look back on the whole thing, I think about all of the young guys that had to leave the island. I knew everybody. You know everybody on the island. There was only about 60 families on the island way back when. And you knew everybody on the island, so you knew all the guys that had to go.
Toronto faced a housing shortage after World War II, so City Council began encouraging year-round residency on the islands. While the decision may have been a stopgap measure as far as the city was concerned, for the cottagers turned residents, the islands had become home.
There was no place for kids to hang out in the wintertime, and we used to go to the fire hall. There was nothing open. There was only a handful of kids, and you'd go to the fire hall and hang out with the firemen. This one guy, Freddie Longstaff, he'd cut up pieces of elastic band and pieces of wax paper and pieces of string, and he'd put them in his tea and drink it down. Like, oh, what? Strictly for the audience.
Fire Station Number 33 was originally located on Manitou Road, at one time the hub of Center Island. In 1960, the fire hall was floated down to Ward's Island and is now home to the Toronto Island Canoe Club.
We would spend a lot of time on the beach. Everybody played ukuleles and banjos, and we would make a lot of noise and drive the people, mostly elderly people living along the beach, crazy with our singing, unamplified. Even unamplified, a ukulele can be pretty irritating.
I always feel at home in a way I never do anywhere else here. And for a kid, it's magical here. You just run out the front door and play.
I think for children, the lack of automobiles is a real bonus, because they're so much freer here than they are in an environment which is sort of car-dominated. I don't have any hate on for cars, don't get me wrong, but I just think that here's an example of what happens when you don't have them.
After the war years, there were upwards of 10,000 people living here on this island. It was amazing the amount of people that were here way back then. And the main street, which was called Manitou Road, where all the hotels and the restaurants and the barber shop and the beauty parlor, the police station and the fire hall, they were all there, all on that main street. I could walk down that main street even today, which they call it the Avenue of the Islands, and the ghosts are just come up out of the ground.
After the Second World War, Toronto expanded rapidly, with 50,000 people a year flooding into the city and into newly built suburbs. After the break, we'll find out how this rapid expansion affected island life. While the Toronto Island community was expanding, so too was the rest of the city. In 1954, Metropolitan Toronto was established to create infrastructure that linked the suburbs to Toronto. This would involve some difficult choices. Metro championed the Gardiner Expressway as a way to alleviate traffic coming to and from the city. Construction on the road that would cut through Parkdale and take up acreage along the lakefront began in 1955. At about the same time, Metro assumed ownership of the islands. For Metro, the islands were an ideal opportunity to recoup the public space lost to the Gardiner.
The decision of Tommy Thompson, the Metro Parks Commissioner of the day, that a park was a park, and it by definition didn't have residents in it. notwithstanding the fact that the residential area took up about 39 of 650 acres, and the two had lived together peacefully since before the turn of the century.
My father got involved because the houses were being torn down after a few years that we were living here.
I moved down to Wards Island in about 1962, and the reason for that was they were taking all the houses at Hanlon's Point, so we had to leave. They expropriated everything there. And I was working at the island school as a caretaker, so I needed to stay on the island. And so I moved down to 164 Lakeshore. And I was there for a couple of years, I guess, and then I bought the place that I'm in right now.
Gradually, the number of houses dwindled from 630 to 262 homes located on both Wards and Algonquin Islands.
My father was the president of the Wards Island Association when we were about to be evicted, and so he got together with the president of the Algonquin Island Association, and they wrote an open letter to the communities saying, what have we got to lose, why don't we fight?
In 1969, Islanders formed the Toronto Island Residents Association as a last-ditch effort to save the remaining island homes. Demolitions ceased during the 70s because of a deadlock between City and Metro Council. Metro Council managed to get writs of possession in 78, but didn't try to serve them until July 28, 1980.
I remember the end of it. The turning point of the battle for the island is the day of the bridge, which is the day that the sheriff was coming to serve us eviction notices, and that was in July 1980. We had people on walkie-talkies. I was on a walkie-talkie down at the Gap, and we had phone chains set up so that the minute we knew the sheriff was coming, people could come home from work. They'd put an old World War II air raid siren on the clubhouse so that it would be signaled that it was coming. Somebody in the Attorney General's office told me what time the sheriff was coming, so we were kind of ready for it. And anyway, so then when the sheriff arrived, the air raid siren goes off, all of us gather at the bridge and stood there while Liz and Ron Mazza negotiated with the sheriff to leave us alone, and so that we could appeal the decision.
No one would have bet a nickel on our being able to fight and win.
After years of legal wrangling, the provincial government stepped in and passed the Toronto Islands Residential Community Stewardship Act. The act, passed in 1993, allowed islanders to purchase 99-year leases from the Land Trust.
My wife and I own this structure, but we don't own the land. And curious enough, I mean, that's not is odd for most people, but there's lots of situations around Ontario where this exists. The thing that's important is that there can be no profit made on the resale of the houses. So there's a controlled resale. So basically when this house is sold, we'll be able to get replacement value for it, and that's all. And Islanders support that. So there's really no speculation here on the island homes. It's a controlled resale. And that's helped to save the unique quality of the island.
Well, just like to express gratitude for the phenomenal support that this community has had from the people of the city over the years. You know, we had a tremendous amount of support from people across the city. And, you know, without all that support, I don't think we would have had a chance to preserve this community and to keep it for another 99 years and to share it with all the many visitors who come here, about 1 million a year.
I think most Islanders love the idea that, you know, it's a stable community, we're able to live here, and it's affordable to live here, and that's very important to us.
I've been away. I was on the lake boats for a season, and my heart just sank that I couldn't be here at the island. In some ways, that's not good. It's like a magnet to me. But having lived, worked, and grown up here, the island is a very special place.
The Toronto Island community has evolved from the humble fishing reserves of the 1830s to the enchanting whimsy of the homes we see today on the eastern shores of the Toronto Islands. I'm Heather Seaman. Join me next time on Structures.